Like Le Corbusier and like Robert Venturi, Rem Koolhaas also, in his early career, in his 30s, took a time out of his practice career to think about architecture, to really be 100% theoretician for a while. And in that period, he was in the United States. He came to New York, and he wrote the book Delirious New York. Now, I know for some people, they read that book and they say, wait, is this an architectural theory book? Because it's written as if it were a kind of history of the development of New York. But in fact, it was 100% a theory book. The telling of this story about New York was a vehicle for Koolhaas to talk about things he thought were important in the world of architecture. And pretty quickly after it was published, it was accepted as that. It was accepted as a whole different way of thinking about architecture and about urbanism that again, like Toward a New Architecture, like Complexity and Contradiction, had an enormous influence not only on the work of Rem Koolhaas, but also on architecture in a broader sense. Rem Koolhaas was born in Rotterdam in the Netherlands in 1944. Of course, that would have been right at the end of World War II. And his early memories of his home city, Rotterdam, was destruction, poverty, the kind of horrors of the war that had been particularly harsh on Rotterdam. Koolhaas's father, Anton Koolhaas, was a very well-known journalist. He edited a leftist newspaper, and that newspaper supported the independence of Indonesia. Indonesia had been a colony of Holland for many centuries. And but Anton Koolhaas was in favor of the independence of Indonesia. Not a popular position to take when you were in the Netherlands. But in the end, Indonesia did get independence, and Anton Koolhaas was one of the few Dutchmen that was welcome in Indonesia, and they in fact invited him to become their Minister of Culture. So the Koolhaas family moved from Rotterdam to Indonesia and to Jakarta, and Rem Koolhaas spent 4 years, very formative years in his youth in Indonesia, and then ended up going back to Rotterdam as he finished high school, studied journalism in college, became a journalist, and was actually very successful as a journalist. I think he's an incredible writer. So, Delirious New York is beautifully written, I think. But he certainly did have a background as a journalist. And then as he was being successful in journalism, he tried a little screenwriting. He did that in the Netherlands and also went to Hollywood and did a little screenwriting for Hollywood. And then at a certain point decided, no, this is not the right career direction for me. I want to study architecture. So in his mid-20s, he goes back to school and goes to the Architectural Association in London. Now, this was an incredible school at that time. The director was a guy named Alvin Boyarsky. It was a very international school, had students from all over the world. Boyarsky was all over publications and incredible lecture series and wonderful blockbuster exhibitions. So the ideas of architecture for the whole world were being germinated often at the AA in London. And that's the milieu that Rem Koolhaas entered as a student when he began there. In 1968, that's when he started, that would have been, of course, a period of incredible turmoil all over the world in terms of just social revolution. So that was very much true at the AA too. It was a radical, radical place to go to school. He graduated then, and he got immediately a fellowship, a Harkness Fellowship. This was an American fellowship, to come to the United States And at first he did that fellowship at Cornell in Ithaca, New York, spent a year there. And then he applied for another fellowship, was enjoying himself in the US, and applied for a fellowship at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. This was a interesting place that Peter Eisenman had kind of co-founded with several of his buddies, and the little think tank. They were kind of like Alvin Boyarsky. They were producing exhibitions and books and things like that. And so Rem Koolhaas gets a fellowship to study there for a year. And it was really in that period of time in New York at IAUS that he begins to write Delirious New York and really conceives the whole book there. Then that was published in 1978. He would have completed it probably by 75, but it didn't get published until 78. And it immediately became a classic. It was a very popular book. It was written in a kind of layperson's language so people could understand it. And it was not only an architecture book, it was just kind of a book about New York. And so it was immediately very popular. And at a relatively young age, this guy gets to be famous as a writer. And he was famous as a writer long before anybody thought of him as an architect. But after he completed the book in about 1975, he says, now it's time for me to start my career and as an architect. And he moves first to London, and he reunites with his buddies from the AA, and there are 4 of them that begin OMA, Office of Metropolitan Architecture. So it would have been Rem Koolhaas and his partner, his wife, Madeline Riesendrop, and 2 of their friends, Elia and Zoe Zangelis. So 2 guys, 2 women, and they started the Office of Metropolitan Architecture. It was a struggle. The 4 of them did not always get along. In fact, I think both couples divorced. I know Rem and Madeline divorced. And financially, it was a freaking disaster. They were always in financial trouble. At one point, they actually sold OMA to a big contracting firm in Rotterdam. And the idea was that this would be the architecture arm of this big contracting firm. And for a while, Rem was all over that idea of integrated practice, but then he realized, oh my gosh, the culture of contractors, make money, all of that was so different from the culture of architecture, produce great environments. So there just was a huge conflict. So OMA separated out from them again. And finally, the kind of financial solution ended up being Rem Koolhaas getting a position at Harvard that gave him some financial stability in the 1990s. And then also his books began to really make some money, not just Delirious New York, but Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, other books that they produced became very popular. So still, the practice struggled for a long time. By 2000, he had won the Pritzker Prize. He was, now beginning to be famous as an architect as well as a writer and as a theoretician. Again, like these other people we've been looking at, there were influences of the era that were very big in Rem Koolhaas's thinking. One is the whole notion of globalization. This was a period where people were moving all over the world. There was much more social mobility. There was much more cultural mobility. He, of course, came from a very international family. He had lived in Jakarta and New York and London and Rotterdam, and that was really the kind of world he was in, was this globalized world. So he was very interested in global business, huge corporations, how they operated. Certainly globalization was, and the kind of practice he set up, which was absolutely about being an international practice from the beginning. This is very much an influence on him. A second thing is this whole notion of consumer culture. He was very interested in status symbols, in things that made people feel good about themselves. When he was teaching at Harvard, he did not teach studios. That was part of the deal he made. But every year he would have a kind of research seminar with graduate students, and they would be studying a topic every year. And one of those topics they studied was shopping. So what is it that makes shopping so wonderful? What is it that makes shopping so appealing to people? And it's that kind of just study of consumer culture and people acquiring things. And he wanted to understand that. And so they wrote a book on shopping. So consumer culture was a huge influence, and the growth of that in this era. And then the third thing was this kind of shift, which Susan Cain, in her book Quiet, describes this shift between a culture of sort of character and admiring people for their character, and the transformation of that to a culture of personality. And it really was mass media, TV, films. It was beginning to create this culture around personalities, stars. Koolhaas was very interested in fame. He was interested in these kind of big lifestyles. So I think that culture of personality was a very, very big factor in his career as well. And then a fourth thing, this was a period of maybe not so much subtlety, but very big spectacle. In a lot of fields, spectacle began to dominate over nuance or subtlety. And you began to get in movies, these movies with tremendous special effects, you know, Star Wars, and video games with incredible special effects, and theme parks and fantasy, all of these things kind of aiming towards spectacle. That again was in the culture, and I think it's something that Rem Koolhaas embraced. So he embraced this notion of spectacle. He embraced this notion of a culture of personality. He embraced this idea of a consumer culture. I embraced this notion of globalization and began to really try to incorporate those things into a set of ideas about architecture. Okay, see you next time.